So in the last video, we saw how to create a table using the create table command, and we saw how we can start listing the attributes in that table with their data type. Now, one of the things that was missing was those primary key and foreign key and constraints that we saw in the tables that were in the SQL files before. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how these are picked and how these are chosen. So when we want to talk about a primary key, we can talk about a primary key as a candidate key. So a candidate key is basically the minimum field or minimum attribute or set of attributes that uniquely identify a record. So let's look at this table here. Let's say you're collecting information and you collected information about some students. So every student, we have their student ID, we have their enrollment number, so you know what order they enrolled in the course, their first name, their last name, and their email address. So this is the data that you need to represent in your database. So this is a sample data, an entity set that you need to represent in your database, and you're thinking about creating the table. So you can say, okay, well, I'm going to create a table called student, and it's going to store the student ID, the roll number, the first name, the last name, the email. This is a varchar, a varchar, a varchar, an int, and an int. And now you need to think, what is the primary key? How am I going to uniquely identify each of these rows in the table? So when you're thinking about that, you're actually thinking about the candidate keys. So the candidate keys, like I said, are the keys that will make sure that every record or every row is unique. To make sure a row is unique, no two rows in that table must have that same value of candidate keys. So let's look at this. Can I use the student ID as a candidate key, as a primary key? I can, because here, if you look at it, it's unique. So the student ID can be used as a primary key. So we say the student ID is a candidate key. Can the first name and last name together be a candidate key? Well, if this is the data, it probably can, because first name and last name, we don't have any duplicate students with the first and last name combined. Can the email address be a candidate key? It can, because no two students will have the same email address. So when we look at candidate keys, there are different options. Student ID can be a candidate key. The enrollment number is also a candidate key, because no two people will be enrolled exactly at the same time and have the same enrollment number. An email address is also a candidate key. Now, even though first name and last name we said can be primary keys, here we don't consider them candidate keys because they are not minimum, because there are other columns in this table that are less number of columns. So here I have one column, here I can have one column, here I have one column, but when I say first name and last name, they are two columns. So even though first name and last name can be used as a primary key, we're not going to call them a candidate key. We're going to call them a composite key. So a composite key is one that is composed of two or more attributes and is minimal, meaning it's not like three that contains like an extra piece of information, and it uniquely identifies an entry. So let's look at this table and let's see what can be a composite key. So here we have a table of the courses. This is the course name. This is the date it was offered. This is the name of the course. So here you see that 125 is C programming and 125 is C programming. Has how many seats are available in that class, how many remaining, what room, and a capacity, the upper capacity if we were to override. So here, if I look at this table, the course code alone cannot uniquely identify a course because a course can be repeated more than once in different semesters. So this one was in January, this one was in July or August. Sorry, July. So here the course code alone cannot be a candidate key. The course name cannot be a candidate key. The date cannot be a candidate key. So I don't have any one column that can be a candidate key. So I have to move and look at two columns. And so if I look at a course and when it was offered, then I can say, okay, well, the course code and the date together can uniquely identify a row in this table. So we call that a composite key because it consists of more than one attribute. Now, when we are looking for a primary key, we are looking for a key that will uniquely identify a row. How are we going to look at them? We're going to look at our candidate keys and we're going to choose from those candidate keys the one that makes the most sense for us. When we choose one of those keys, we call that the primary key. So when we're looking at our candidate keys and we choose one of them, we're going to call that the primary key. So we looked at our candidate, three of them, and the other primary key, all those the alternate keys. Okay, so from the candidate keys, we choose our primary key, and whatever we don't choose as the primary key, we leave those as the alternate keys. And we saw before that the primary key, when we're doing the ER model, when we're doing the diagram, we put a line under it. It's underlined. Make sure that when you're choosing a primary key, you're choosing a column that cannot be null. You can't have a primary key column and then put null. So insert a student and they don't have a student ID because the student ID is what uniquely identifies that row. So you can't leave it null. So the primary key column, it cannot be null. And you will find that Oracle enforces that without even us putting that enforcement in or adding that constraint in. Now, when we talked about foreign keys before, we said that foreign keys are basically primary keys from another table. So here I have a table that has the student ID, their first name, last name, and the course that they're taking. And then here I have another table that has the course ID and the course name. Let's look at each table. The way I uniquely identify a row in my first table is if I look at this table, I can choose the student ID as my primary key. If I look at the second table, I can look at the course name and course ID, and I can decide the course ID is the unique way of identifying that table. So we say the student ID and the course ID are the primary keys. Now, here there is a relationship between those two tables. Here, when I'm referring to a course ID, I don't know the course name. Where can I get that information? From the second table. So this course ID that exists in the student table is actually corresponding to a course ID in my courses table or courses catalog, kind of. So this ID here must exist in my courses. I can't say course ID X12 when I don't have any course name that corresponds to X12 as the course ID. So here, to make sure that this actually does exist, we call this a foreign key. So this column is a foreign key because it is storing the primary key of a course in another table. Now let's think back to when we were talking about entities and we said strong entity and weak entity. Which one of these entities do you think is strong? It doesn't depend on anyone else. If you set the second table here, the courses table, you're right. So initially I can add all my courses into my database, all the course IDs and course names. And then after creating my strong entity, I can go ahead and create my weak entity or my dependent entity and start using this course ID. So any table that has foreign keys in it is dependent on some other table, and it is a weak entity, like we mentioned before. The next thing we want to talk about is constraints. So when we learned to create the table, we learned to create the table with just the column names and their data types in the last video. Now what we were doing is adding those extra pieces of information: primary key, foreign key, and constraint. So constraints, there are many constraints that we can put on columns to make sure that they are accurate and we have data integrity, so we don't insert bad data into our database. So the first constraint is saying not null. So you can force a column to have a value. You can also put the word unique, and that will force that 2 rows have the same value for that. Sorry, no 2 rows will have the same value for that column. When you come next to a table and you say primary key, you are adding a constraint that this column is going to be unique and it cannot be null because it's going to be used to uniquely identify a row. When you come to a column and you say that this column is a foreign key, you are telling Oracle underlying that it needs to make sure that this is a primary key in another table. There's another constraint called default, which it's not really a constraint, but you can use it to assign a specific value if a value is not given for that column. And in SQL Developer, we can see these constraints, and I will show you that when we start talking about how to actually create those constraints. So in the next video, we'll talk more about creating those tables with the constraints that we talked about.